Italian ruins that brought war to the big screen.
And the fear must have been reeking out of everybody's pores. They weren't in Hollywood anymore.
A striking relic hidden in a Scottish forest.
You come upon this kind of mind-blowing set of buildings that don't look like anything you'd expect to see here.
An isolated desert town in Chile, where progress turned to horror.
Over time, that isolation was mobilized for different and more sinister purposes.
And a compound in Germany that saw an old technology come to the rescue.
It looks imposing from outside, but if you get right down to it, it's really a great illusion in many respects.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. Hidden deep within a Scottish forest is an enchanting structure with uncertain origins.
As you approach through the forest and across this old bridge, you start to catch glimpses of something massive and stark.
And then, out of the foliage emerges something almost otherworldly.
Its bold design and strange mix of spaces seems to defy explanation.
With its stacks of concrete floors, parts of it look a little bit like a high-tech parking garage, but maybe one that survived a neutron bomb.
These semi-dome structures look like fingers pointing upwards, almost as if they're hands cradling the structure from each side.
At the end of this large open hall, with the dappled light beaming in, it really does feel like a magical, spiritual space.
The architects wanted it to become a work of art rather than just a utilitarian structure.
But was it cursed right from the start?
This was a place of great hope, but it barely lasted a blink of an eye before it was abandoned.
Today, this place is known to many as nothing more than a spellbinding ruin. Architectural historian Diane Waters has spent 25 years uncovering its lost story.
What it is now is so unrelated to what it originally was. It's become a kind of mythical, romantic ruin of international status. And it's become a focus of artists and writers and historians.
This is one of, if not the most famous modern buildings in Scotland. Yet few people even know what it was used for.
Amongst all the angular concrete and cavernous interiors, there is something here that feels out of place.
Right at the back of the main structure are these foundations of what looks to have been quite a grand building, but they seem strangely close together.
You know, I first came here in 1994 while this building was still standing. Soon after 1994, it was actually burnt down completely. And then once this building had gone, the design rationale for the whole extension had disappeared. And the modern extension stands on its own.
But what linked these two very different structures?
There is one purpose, one cultural function that has probably produced more grand, soaring structures than any other single activity through history.
Well, this is where the story of St. Peter's Cardross began in 1948, when it was the first home of the training of the priests for the Catholic Church.
After the Second World War, the number of young men signing up to a life in the church was on the rise.
It was decided that they needed a new, bigger school for all the people they expected to be training for the priesthood.
And there was an immense sense of optimism amongst church officers. And this structure was meant to be the physical embodiment of that future.
Construction began in 1961. But behind this futuristic design lies an ancient concept.
The layout is actually based on the historic building. So the idea was to create a cloister, a kind of medieval-like cloister around the historic building. Its function seems almost ancient and monastic, and its architectural forms are stunningly modern. So there's this kind of contrast between the style and the function of the building.
The main building is a key element that forms a courtyard with the wings angling off of it. And all the different parts of the college were supposed to interact with this original building.
The first trainee priests arrived here in 1966. Much of their time was spent in contemplation and prayer.
These are what are commonly called the fingers, but actually they are side chapels for the trainee priests to have private prayer.
And this cavernous space at the heart of the complex was devoted to the main service, Mass.
Here we are in the middle of what was the chapel, the main chapel, what the architects called the kernel of the whole complex. The sides here, we would have the trainee priests sitting in pews along here with the focus on the main altar.
And that's the most dramatic space in the complex, highlighted by these remarkable stone altars.
But with its striking form came a problem.
The building looks incredible and almost space age in style, but practically speaking, it was in many ways a disaster.
There's fantastic accounts in the student magazine of coming down and this whole central area of the chapel being underwater.
What you also see here is something that isn't that uncommon with groundbreaking architecture. They still had a few bugs to work out. The heat didn't work that well. The windows were cold and drafty. There were leaks. It was damp, kind of moldy.
Yet it wasn't design flaws that spelled disaster here. A momentous decision made over 1,000 miles away doomed St. Peter's Seminary before it even opened its doors. And it came from the very top.
During the Second Vatican Council, which ran from 1962 to 1965, it was determined that the training of priests would be more a visible part of the community.
They decided they should be learning among the people they would ultimately serve as priests. So St. Peter's Seminary didn't really reflect that.
As vast cultural changes swept across Europe in the 1960s, the Catholic Church moved to bring themselves more in line with the modern world. But with construction already underway, St. Peter's would be left behind.
It was here out in the woods in this beautiful, quiet setting, but it certainly wasn't part of the community and engaged in public life the way that priests were now expected to be.
I interviewed priests who taught here, and what they said from the very beginning is that there were far too many altars. The ideas from the Second Vatican Council had been that you were to preach together with the community in groups of priests rather than solitary praying. So they almost became redundant from the very beginning.
By the time it was finished, it was already out of date and basically doomed to failure.
St. Peter's limped on as a seminary for only 14 years. After it was abandoned and the old house at its heart had burnt down, it became its best-known self, the beguiling ruins in the forest.
In many ways, it's become much more celebrated as a ruin, as an abandoned building, than it ever was as a functioning complex.
It attracts visitors from all over the world, curious about its original purpose, and it has a cult status among architects and urban explorers alike.
Today, after years of campaigning to preserve this iconic structure, hope is on the horizon.
What do you do about a work of architecture that was really groundbreaking and important in its time, but never really delivered its purpose? Do you repurpose it? Do you save it? Do you turn it into something new? Not every ambitious building succeeds in its initial purpose, but that doesn't mean they all need to be torn down.
Currently, a charitable trust is trying to develop a new vision with education at its core.
In the Italian mountains is a quiet village made famous on the silver screen.
It all looks exactly like what you'd expect Central Italy to look like. Olive groves, rolling hills, mountains, and beautiful old historic villages.
Except for this Italian village is a ghost town. We see the remains of a battle-scarred church, and we see sort of tumble-down homes and shops along these old winding lanes.
As you move through the village, you can see that the old stone houses have been absolutely smashed. You can still see fragments of what must have been roof beams or furniture. Everything has become a sort of chaotic ruin.
The story of this place is tied to a man who came here 80 years ago.
He was used to bending other people to his will. He was the ruler of the crew and assaulted the surrounding mountains.
These chaotic ruins and their hard-nosed visitor set the stage for an audacious deception, one that would cement this decaying village in history forever. Historian Gaetano De Angelis Cortis has come to tell the story of the place he knows so well.
Questo luogo, essendo un luogo molto famoso in tutto il territorio, tutti i bambini che io da bambino quindi ho sentito parlare nei racconti delle persone, degli anziani, della famiglia, è una storia che mi ha appassionato molto perché parla del mio territorio.
This scene that captured Gaetano's imagination was the site of a fierce battle, one that was witnessed by millions in a groundbreaking documentary.
From the end of October 1943 until the middle of December, San Petro and the surrounding ground was the scene of some of the bitterest fighting on our Fifth Army front.
Nothing like this had really been seen. This kind of combat footage, raw and honest, including the death and destruction. No one had really seen anything quite like this.
And the film was replete with scenes of heroism. It showed gritty American GIs struggling against heavy German fire.
So for Americans, this was a good story because they saw American boys succeeding in defeating the Nazis in Europe. And for Italians, this was a story of getting back their national self-respect.
The film was praised by Hollywood's best, but this documentary was a lie. 2 years earlier, an American serviceman came to Italy with a very special assignment. His name was John Huston.
John Huston was an interesting figure. You know, he was a guy who'd been working in Hollywood after drifting around America as a boxer, a painter, an actor, but then he really finds his métier in Hollywood.
Huston's first movies had been a success. So in 1943, he was deployed to Italy to make documentaries of the Allied victory.
So Huston says, I'm going to go up into the mountains. I'm going to go to a place like San Petro where the fighting is heaviest, and I'm going to film the battle there for the American home front. But he missed it.
When Huston and his crew arrived at San Pietro, they were bombarded by German shelling.
The Germans have already withdrawn, but it's a careful tactical withdrawal just to the northern rim of hills beyond the village. So they're still firing on San Pietro. German artillery is still in position.
They took cover with the sheltering residents.
Quando John Huston si riparò dal bombardamento tedesco e americano su San Pietro infine, entrò in un rifugio insieme anche ai suoi collaboratori, il suo cameraman, e insieme alla popolazione di San Pietro. Quando fu all'interno si rese conto che questo suo cameraman aveva uno shock per cui tremava visibilmente. Cercò di rincuorarlo, cercò in qualche maniera di rinfrancarlo, però il bombardamento era molto intenso per cui la paura del cameraman era molto alta.
After several long hours, the shelling stopped.
So once the Germans have covered their retreat to their next defensive line, the German artillery switches off. And at that point, the villagers of San Pietro are able to move back out into the fresh air, and John Huston and his crew are able to move out with them.
When Huston emerges from these caves, he looks around, he shoots some B-roll of corpses and shattered buildings and shell casings, but there's no real combat going on.
The Battle of San Pietro was over. Huston had missed his moment.
So Huston has the idea, I've got all these GIs milling around that have been through the battle, that they remember what it was like and the experience is fresh in their minds. Okay, I'm gonna recreate the Battle of San Pietro.
So, armed with a stock of film and a cast of soldiers, Huston's cameras started rolling on a reconstruction of the Battle of San Pietro.
So they're firing their weapons, they're taking cover from incoming German fire, they're flinging grenades. He took care to use concussion grenades, not fragmentation grenades, but the viewer can't tell the difference. And he kind of recreates the harrowing mood of the place. He instructs these GIs to occasionally turn and look directly at the camera so as to communicate the stress they're under, the strain of battle, and it gives it a really immediate effect, all of which become trademarks of this, award-winning Battle of San Pietro film.
Some 200 yards forward, they encountered mines and automatic fire from pillboxes.
In the heat of battle, the camera pans. An Allied soldier is shot, he falls. Everyone in the cinema is shocked. They have just watched the extinction of a human life. And then Huston shouts, "Cut!" and the guy gets back up again.
But not everything that Huston captured at San Pietro was fake.
The grim toll of the Battle of San Pietro was caught on film, and real soldiers being wrapped up and eventually shipped home. That was part of the reality of war being communicated to Americans back home.
The military brass initially didn't like that. They kept pushing them to change it, to soften it. They didn't want the people back home or the troops in training to see these images of young Americans who'd been cut down in this battle.
And there was something else that Houston captured for real.
An aspect of this film that is not staged is the relief of the survivors. You see these children and adults coming out of hiding where they've been in the caves to avoid the Allied and German bombardments, and they come into their shattered town and they're kind of milling around in the rubble of their old homes and shops and church. But they're just beaming, they're happy, because for them at least, the war is really over.
Questo angolo della città di San Pietro è importante perché qui a San Pietro, nel momento in cui si trovava John Huston a girare il suo documentario, ha ripreso proprio questa strada, proprio questo angolo, mentre veniva liberato dalle macerie, mentre si cercava di riportare quindi a una situazione di pseudo-normalità.
At the end of the war, Houston's San Pietro was shown across the United States and Italy. It was praised for its depiction of a fight to the death between good and evil. But John Huston kept the secret of his documentary to the end of his life.
A lot of people criticized Houston later when it came out, how little of the film had really been shot documentary style, and about his dishonesty and how he portrayed the film. But director Martin Scorsese later said that he was working in the service of a greater truth, a harder truth.
In eastern Germany, on the outskirts of Berlin, is an entire village that's fallen silent.
The trees do a pretty good job of hiding just how extensive this site is, but you can still just about see the tops of the buildings poking out above the canopy.
It is a major facility of some kind, surrounded by a great wall.
What I see here is a lot of utilitarian buildings, almost as though they're big sheds, up close to each other.
And the outside walls are littered with revealing details.
Some of the walls have plaques or stone carvings on the outside, which hint at how this place might have been used.
You have these beautiful murals on the various buildings, all relating to the animal kingdom. There might be some kind of zoo or animal husbandry function to this sprawling facility.
So who or what was it all built to house? The story of what happened here has not traveled far, even to this day. Its secrets remain only in the hands of a few keen locals. Brigitte Baumann is one of them.
Also das erste Mal Krampnis gesehen habe ich, als hier noch die sowjetische Armee war, aber nur von außen.
And it's the grand nature of this place that makes it so intriguing.
These buildings are really starting to fall apart inside, but they still maintain a sense of grandeur.
We've got gorgeous, lavish rooms, clearly built to impress people. And when you look at them empty, they make me feel chilly.
Das war für die Offiziere, für Tanzveranstaltungen, für gesellige Abende, für Kinoveranstaltungen. Es gab ein Café mit einer schönen Terrasse zum Krampnitzer See.
This was once the grand Krempnitz Cavalry School.
Die Reiter und die Kavallerie waren ja in der preußischen Armee, in der deutschen Armee repräsentativ geworden, sehr groß geworden. Und in den 1930er Jahren hat die Regierung entschieden, dass eine Reit- und Fahrschule in der Nähe der Hauptstadt gebaut wird. Also auf diesem Gelände waren insgesamt 3.500 Soldaten und 1.800 Pferde.
A lot of really famous German generals come through Krempnitz to complete their training. In the 1936 Olympics, the Germans get gold and silver medals in events like show jumping and dressage. So there's this real cavalry tradition in Germany.
Wir sind jetzt hier in dem Ehrenpreiszimmer. Hier haben wir an der Wand überall die Schränke gehabt, wo die Reiterpokale ausgestellt waren, die die Offiziere bei Olympischen Spielen zum Beispiel gewonnen haben.
But this luxurious world would soon be tipped upside down. With the arrival of the Second World War, the old traditions here were supplanted by new technologies.
There needs to be a place to train people to do the old horse cavalry tasks. And that's going to be done now by soldiers in fast-moving reconnaissance vehicles and light tanks instead of horses.
The age of the German tank, known as the Panzer, had arrived. Krempnitz quickly developed to prioritize training on these new armored vehicles.
In a way, the Panzers are attacking in the style of the old shock cavalry, where you'd have this heavy cavalry with steel breastplates galloping at the enemy.
They could cross ditches and crush barbed wire. There was no denying it. Toe-to-toe with a horse, the Panzer was by far the meaner beast on the battlefield.
Panzers played the key role in a revolutionary new tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war.
The armor forces in the German army are not just tanks. They're fast-moving tanks with radios. That means that a German tank commander handles his tanks differently from everybody else.
These armored spearheads that'll rip through the enemy line and be followed by infantry that will come in quickly behind to consolidate the victory.
At first, this achieved great success. But when Hitler turned his tanks towards the vast expanses of Russia, their fatal flaw would be revealed.
Advancing wasn't a problem for the Germans in Russia. The real challenge was waiting for the vital supplies of food and fuel to catch up.
Panzers are only as good as the logistical train that's following them. The fuel trucks, the motorized infantry that has to be able to keep up with the Panzers so they don't get surrounded and isolated and picked apart by anti-tank weapons.
The freezing temperatures also played havoc with all the German vehicles. The engines just gave up and turned whatever they were powering into huge roadblocks.
But the vast distances and horrific weather on the Eastern Front exposed a more fundamental weakness in the Nazi war machine.
The German army in World War II, it's really a great illusion in many respects. It looks imposing from outside, but if you get right down to it, it has these kind of gleaming armored spearheads, but the rest of it is really a 19th century army.
To keep their armies progressing, the Germans relied on some unlikely heroes, and many were trained here at Krempnitz.
Um den Feldzug nach Russland vorzubereiten, hat man ja auch sehr viele Pferde gebraucht.
A horse could carry on. As long as you put good shoes on them, they can get on through mud. A horse didn't need to have its fuel delivered from Romania or Germany. A horse could eat the local grain, the local fodder.
Despite the Nazis' grand ambitions for mechanized superiority, in reality, their armies depended heavily on horses.
And one of the great ironies of the war, of course, is that, the Panzer gets all the credit, and yet at the end of these long supply lines, the Panzers are often being kept in the field by long lines of horse-drawn fuel trucks.
More than 80% of the German combat strength was pulled by these beasts of burden. But despite the best efforts of the 625,000 pack horses active on the Eastern Front, the Nazis' advance crumbled, leaving 300,000 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines at Stalingrad.
The German soldiers were unable to look after themselves, never mind their animals. They couldn't keep shoes on their feet and food in their bellies.
So without food, many of the Nazi soldiers ate the only things that were available to them. They ate rats, and of course, before that, they ate the horses.
Eventually, the Soviets would push the Nazi forces all the way back to within 15 miles of here, capturing Berlin and ending the war. And while the common soldier was left to fend for themselves, the prized horses and trophies at Krampnitz were handed over to American troops. Though it was Hitler who ordered the Nazi armies on to the Eastern Front, it was not he who suffered there.
Not only did the German soldier die in the service of their insane Führer, it meant that the German horse innocently died in the service of their insane Führer.
Deep within the Atacama Desert, isolated from the modern world, sits a time capsule of Chile's past.
From the dust of this expansive desert, suddenly there's this sprawling town.
The whole place is derelict as far as the eye can see.
There's an industrial section, there's retail, there's residential. This is, or at least this was, a proper community.
Set in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, why would anyone choose to make this their home?
There's a real feeling of utter isolation. In this town, no one can hear you scream.
There has to have been a reason for being there, and these reasons usually revolve around some sort of resource.
This explains the industrial machinery, but there are some things here that don't add up.
When you look around the perimeter, you see that people took the trouble to put minefields down.
This place was designed with a utopian vision of the future, but by the end, it became a nightmare.
Local researcher Luis Enrique Silva Guerrero knows the difficulties of living in this harsh climate.
Looking to the horizon, north, south, east, and west, the only thing you see is dryness. It isn't a place that calls man to settle down here. It's very hostile.
It would have been no small feat to basically build this site. There's almost no natural resources to sustain itself on its own.
And yet there has to have been something there in the ground that makes it worthwhile. But what exactly was it?
If you know what to look for, the reason for Chacabuco's existence is in plain sight.
Over there, you can see the deposits of nitrate.
In the early 19th century, it was discovered that nitrates known as saltpeter were a miracle fertilizer.
Here, the concentration of saltpeter was actually at the surface, so it was very, very easy to mine.
The raw material went through those tunnels into the crushing machine, and once it was crushed in fine pieces, it was transported to that building over there.
These huge vats of boiling water were used to gradually dissolve the chemicals out of the pulverized rocks.
All of these pipes and networks and so on are part of this process by which you're able to try and purify the ore, then essentially reprocess and reprocess along different sections to completely purify the final product.
With a global intensification in agriculture, the demand for saltpeter skyrocketed. Chacabuco became a boomtown.
The mine became very successful. In fact, some of the other local areas were bringing some of their resource to the mine to be processed because it was actually that efficient at being able to generate the ore.
And it wasn't just the industry here that was revolutionary.
This town was created with a sort of corporate welfare vision that if we can pull the worker away from cramped living conditions in the city and provide them with clean living arrangements and leisure time, then they might be better workers and they might be healthier.
They were provided for, they were looked after. They had lovely houses, they had shops, they had a church, they had a community center, they had a theater.
But there is evidence that life here was not entirely utopian.
What's interesting about the layout of this town is that it seems like it's almost designed to surveil the people there. That at the center of this community, you have the tallest buildings with the tallest rooftops, and from there, they can almost see the inner workings of everything going on in their community.
We now know that the people who lived in this community were being watched. And we have records of people's intimate lives being surveilled by company security.
They maintained records of which house was making too much noise or causing too much trouble, or other instances where workers were passing out socialist newspapers.
But corporate surveillance was nothing compared to what came next.
Before too long, this community became something very different, a darker place.
The last kind of vestiges of life that you can see in and around the buildings is the graffiti. And this is graffiti of a very political nature.
In 1938, the industry here ground to a halt. And the town was left to the elements. But in 1973, everything changed. Allegedly with support from the CIA, a right-wing group launched a coup. Their leader, Augusto Pinochet.
Augusto Pinochet was a ruthless dictator. He controlled Chile in a way that was brutal. It was repressive.
Pinochet's political opponents could be anyone, but it could also be their families and even their children.
Anyone who disagreed with the new junta quickly vanished. And where better to make people disappear than in the middle of a desert?
So not only were the buildings already there, but you didn't have to go far from the buildings and you were in the harshest, driest desert on the planet. It became the ideal place to lock people away from prying eyes.
And these homes that used to belong to individuals suddenly became great cells for prisoners.
Roberto Sepulveda is part of the organization that now preserves Chacabuco.
Yo tuve la oportunidad de andar por fuera de este lugar en los años 73. Y esto es exactamente como vemos en el cine, los campos de concentración alemanes, con cercos eléctricos, con perros entrenados para ¿cómo se llama?, evitar que se fueran a fugar, circundado con minas personales, con tanques haciendo presión, con aviones atravesando por sobre el campamento.
From the moment the prisoners arrived, conditions were brutal.
Cuando los prisioneros llegaban acá, con este sol que tenemos hoy día, los tenían horas parados en lo que fue después una cancha de fútbol, donde los hacían desnudarse, vaciar sus bolsas que traían con sus cosas.
Most of the prisoners faced harassment, and few had enough rations to barely keep them alive.
So people who were held here were expendable as far as the Chilean regime was concerned.
At its height, over 1,000 people were held here, most of them innocent. But their spirit of resistance is etched into the walls.
En los lugares donde vivieron los prisioneros, ellos dejaron muchos testimonios en las paredes. Si ustedes miran otras casas, van a ver muchos testimonios.
The concentration camp at Chacabuco was closed after only 2 years, and the authorities quickly tried to cover up what they did here.
They stripped away a lot of the evidence, and they tried to purify this place.
Los atropellos a la dignidad, a la tortura psicológica, a la tortura física, fueron expresiones que fueron quedando. Los militares hicieron borrar esos testimonios.
Today, Chacabuco lies derelict, but its history of pioneering industry and cruel repression leaves a complicated legacy.
It's important to remember some of the unsavory elements of history so that we can continue to learn from them, that we can see warning signs of authoritarianism when we see them again.
Este es un sitio que contiene muchas emociones. Nosotros queremos que esto siga siendo recordado, que la gente venga. Dicen que los pueblos que olvidan su historia están condenados a repetirla.